very similar to the way one might bake a cake. You do know that everything that goes in a cake doesn't taste good by itself, right? For example, flour doesn't have a taste to it, but butter does. And every cake has to have some flavor. Now, I love the smell of vanilla extract, a little vanilla flavor. But just to taste it by itself, it's not very good. What about raw eggs? Anybody have any raw eggs this morning? Nobody really wants raw eggs. But you have to have raw eggs in a cake, right? And every cake needs to have a little salt, a little baking powder, and the sweetest ingredient on the plate, which is sugar. Every cake has to have some sugar. So when you get a big bowl and you put all those ingredients inside to make the most delicious cake, you have to stir it up. Stir it up, stir it up, stir it up, stir it up, so you can sing. Stir it up, stir it up, stir it up, stir it up, so you can sing. Now that I know the beauty of my past, I can stand up and share it with you. Stir it up, stir it up, stir it up, sing. Stir it up, stir it up, so you can sing. Now that I know the beauty of my past, I can stand up and share it with you. Stir it up, stir it up, stir it up, sing. Stir it up, stir it up, so you can sing. And you know, so it is with African American history. There's a bitter and there's a sweet. But throughout it all, we survived. We did. You know, our journey as African Americans hasn't been an easy one. No, sir. No, ma'am. It hasn't been like going to the mailbox and back, or going to the corner store, or jogging around the block. No, sir. Our journey in America has not been an easy one. We've had to walk the highways and the dirt roads of America to obtain our freedom. We've had to use our feet to run away from our problems, and sometimes we've had to use our feet to run towards our problems in order to solve them. Sometimes. 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 Sometimes alone. Sometimes through the Underground Railroad. We've had to use our brains to reason through our problems. Sometimes. It has taken strong and courageous men, women, and children to lay their lives on the line to free a fellow slave to come out of the darkness and into the marvelous light of liberty. It has taken strong and courageous men, women, and children to lead the way to better education and simple civil rights. It was 1865 and the Civil War ended. That meant that over 4 million slaves were set free. By the end of the 1930s, there were only 100,000 of these ex-slaves still alive. And then during the middle of the Great Depression, the Federal Writers Project sent out writers to seek out these former slaves and to write their stories. Now, many of these slaves did not want to tell their stories for fear that they would be harmed or even murdered for telling the truth. They still lived, most of them, in the Deep South, and they were afraid. But some understood that they were very, very old, and they would not live much longer. So they decided to tell their stories. These are the last accounts of those ex-slaves living before and after the Civil War. There was a whole lifetime of slavery. when you were born, you were 5 or 6 years old, you might find yourself in the big house, working for the master, or taking care of the master's children and being a playmate to the master. Henry Coleman tells his story about living in the big house. When I was a little boy, I lived in the big house. I didn't have no learning, wasn't allowed no learning, but I did learn to talk by associating with my master. Now these white folks, they raised peacocks. And at night these peacocks would roost up in the pine trees. It was our job to go up in the pine trees and pull those feathers from the peacocks. Then my mama would take those feathers and she'd bind those feathers together and make what you call a fly brush. And my job was to go into the dining hall and there would be a swing over the table. And they would hoist me up on that swing. And they put that fly brush in my hand. My job was to swing back and forth and back and forth over the dinner table. It was my job to keep the gnats and the flies off of the missus's dinner table. You might have thought that it's an easy job, but it wasn't. Because if I was to get one of those peacock feathers in the missus's gravy, I'd get a beating for sure. Sometimes I'd be up there late at night just to swing back and forth and back and forth. Sometimes I'd be so sleepy and tired, I'd go to sleep. And that there was my job when I was a little boy on the plantation. By the age of 12, most slaves were working in the fields. They worked from sunup to sundown 7 days a week, and sometimes even on Sundays. The slaves were almost always cold, always barely clothed, and always hungry. Always hungry. Well, what did they do on the plantation? It was the slave's job to seed the land, to plow the land, to tend the land, to fetch the water, to feed the animals, to chop the wood. It was the slave's job to take care of all of the property around the plantation and to take care of the plantation itself. It was the slave's job to take care of the toilet duties on the plantation and to take care of their masters. Bells and Homer